The moment Isaiah Bristol walked through the door of Eva Monroe's seamstress shop and asked her to make a wedding dress for a woman he hadn't yet proposed to, Eva laughed so hard she nearly knocked her pincushion off the counter. And that laugh, bright and unguarded and entirely unladylike, was the precise moment Isaiah Bristol knew he was already in serious trouble. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas, sat like a sun-baked coin on the edge of the Chisholm Trail, humming with cattle drives and dust, and the particular restless energy of a place that couldn't quite decide whether it wanted to be civilized or wild. The cattle drovers came through in waves every season, bringing money and trouble in roughly equal measure, and the permanent residents of Caldwell had learned to brace themselves for both. The town had a sheriff, 3 saloons, a general store, a livery stable, a small church with a crooked steeple, and Eva Monroe's seamstress shop, which sat between the post office and the barber, its window always displaying something freshly stitched and lovely in a town that had precious little of either. Eva Monroe was 26 years old, though she moved through life with the deliberate self-possession of a woman who had been managing her own affairs for a very long time. She had come to Caldwell 4 years earlier, arriving on the stage from Missouri after her mother's death left her with a modest inheritance, a sewing machine, and no particular reason to stay anywhere she had been before. She was not a woman who inspired the sort of soft, wistful poetry that some men wrote about the women they admired. She was sharp-eyed and quick-tongued, and she had a way of looking directly at a person that made them feel pleasantly transparent, as though she could see not only what they were but what they might become. Her hair was the deep, warm brown of walnut wood, and she kept it pinned practically at the nape of her neck during working hours, though small pieces of it were always escaping around her temples by midday, curling in the Kansas heat into something that was considerably less practical and considerably more charming. Her hands were always slightly calloused from the needle, and she thought of that as a badge rather than a flaw. She had built a real business in Caldwell, which was not a small achievement for a woman alone. She made work clothes and Sunday clothes and curtains and quilts, and she had once, memorably, repaired the tent of a traveling medicine show man in exchange for a bottle of something he claimed would cure rheumatism, and which smelled strongly of pine and whiskey. The women of Caldwell trusted her, which was the most valuable currency in any small town, and the men who came through on the trail had learned quickly that her shop was not a place to loiter without genuine business, because Eva Monroe had a look she gave wandering cowboys that was more effective than any lock and key. Isaiah Bristol had not intended to wander. He had intended to conduct a very specific piece of business, and he had walked into her shop that Tuesday morning in May with his hat in his hands, and what he privately considered to be a perfectly reasonable request. Isaiah was 31 years old, and he had the kind of face that a person kept looking at without quite meaning to, not because it was conventionally handsome in any particularly polished way, but because it was honest. Every emotion he had ever felt seemed to have left some mark on it, the squint lines from years of sun, the faint scar along his jaw from a fall off a horse when he was 19, the way his eyes went very still and direct when he was being serious, which was most of the time. He was tall and broadly built in the way that came from actual work rather than performance, and he wore his clothes the way working men wore their clothes, which was to say they fit him, and he didn't think much about them beyond that. He had come to Caldwell 3 years ago with a small herd, a borrowed stake, and a stubborn conviction that the land just south of town could be turned into something worth having. He had been right. The Bristol ranch now ran 400 head and employed 6 hands, and Isaiah had built the main house himself over the course of 2 winters, working through the cold with a determination that his ranch hand Pete Dalloway described as either admirable or troubling depending on the day. He walked into Eva Monroe's shop, and the little bell above the door announced him, and she looked up from behind the counter where she was hemming something blue, and he cleared his throat and said, "Miss Monroe." I need a wedding dress made. Eva set down her needle. She looked at him with calm attention. For your wife, she asked. Not yet my wife, he said. For your betrothed, then. Not yet that either, he said. Eva Monroe studied him for a moment and then she laughed. It was a full, genuine laugh, not the polite kind that people deploy to soften awkward moments, but the real kind that comes from being genuinely and helplessly amused. She pressed one hand flat on the counter to steady herself, and the other hand came up to cover her mouth, and her eyes, which were a particular shade of gray-green that Isaiah was only just now noticing for the first time in 3 years of living in the same town, crinkled at the corners with the force of it. You want me to make a wedding dress, she said, when she had gathered herself, for a woman you have not proposed to. That is correct, Isaiah said, and his voice was perfectly even, which somehow made it funnier, and Eva pressed her hand more firmly over her mouth. What if she says no? Eva asked. She won't, Isaiah said with a confidence that was so absolute it circled back around to being almost endearing. You cannot know that, Eva said. I know it, he said simply. Eva looked at him with the expression she reserved for situations she found simultaneously exasperating and interesting. Who is she? She asked. And this was the part where Isaiah Bristol's certainty developed its first small fracture. Because the truth was, Isaiah had come into this shop knowing exactly what he wanted and almost entirely failing to account for the perfectly reasonable question of who it was for. He had spent the past 3 weeks becoming increasingly aware that he was going to marry someone, and the awareness had arrived not as a question, but as a statement of fact that his own mind had apparently delivered without his conscious permission. He knew the someone. He had known her for 3 years. The problem was that standing here in her shop, with her laughing at him and her gray-green eyes bright with genuine amusement, and those small pieces of walnut-brown hair curling around her temples, he was beginning to realize with a slow and somewhat alarming clarity that his subconscious mind had been considerably ahead of his conscious one, and that the wedding dress he had walked in here to commission had always, on some level he was only now discovering, been meant for the woman standing right in front of him. He did not say any of this. What he said was, I need to think on some details. Eva raised both her eyebrows. You want to commission a wedding dress and you need to think on the details, she repeated. The measurements, he said. I need to get you the measurements. Measurements of whom? Eva asked, and there was something in her voice that was less amused now and more genuinely curious, tilted slightly toward a question she wasn't quite asking. I'll come back, Isaiah said. He put his hat back on his head, nodded to her with the particular dignity of a man who was making an extremely dignified retreat from a situation he had thoroughly misjudged, and walked out of her shop into the bright Kansas morning. Eva stared at the door for a full 30 seconds after it closed. Then she picked up her needle and went back to the blue hem, but she found that her attention kept drifting toward the door and away from the thread, and that the smile on her face was taking considerably longer to fade than was strictly warranted. Isaiah walked back to where he had tied his horse outside the general store and stood there with his hand on the saddle horn, not mounting, just thinking. Pete Dalloway was leaning against the post nearby, chewing on a piece of dried grass and watching him with the expression of a man who had seen his employer do inexplicable things before and had learned to wait them out. How'd it go? Pete asked. Fine, Isaiah said. Pete chewed his grass. You get the dress commissioned. There were details to sort out, Isaiah said. Pete was quiet for a moment. He was 43 years old and had worked ranches in Texas and New Mexico before coming north to Caldwell, and he had a slow, weathered perceptiveness that Isaiah both valued and occasionally found inconvenient. What exactly is your plan here, boss? Pete asked. Isaiah looked at him. I'm working on it, he said. You've been working on it for 3 weeks, Pete observed. I'm still working on it, Isaiah said. He mounted his horse and rode back toward the ranch, and he spent the entire ride thinking about gray-green eyes and a laugh that had absolutely no business being as attractive as it was. The thing about Eva Monroe that Isaiah had known for 3 years, and somehow not properly accounted for, was that she was not a woman who would take well to being managed or maneuvered. He had watched her handle difficult customers and difficult situations with a brisk competence that he had always admired from a distance, and he understood instinctively that the direct approach was the only one that had any chance of working with her. The problem was that the direct approach required him to figure out what he was actually trying to say, and he was finding that considerably more complicated than roping a steer or managing a herd through a Texas norther. He spent 2 days at the ranch attending to legitimate ranch business, which helped somewhat. There were fence lines to check, and a water trough that needed repair, and a dispute between 2 of his hands that required mediating, and the practical demands of the work settled something in him that the uncertainty had been disturbing. On the 3rd day he rode back into Caldwell, ostensibly to collect supplies from the general store, and found himself standing outside Eva Monroe's shop with a sack of flour in his arms and no particular reason to go in. He went in anyway. Eva was at her machine this time, working a treadle in a steady rhythm, and she glanced up when the bell announced him and did not stop working. "Mr. Bristol," she said, "have you sorted your details?" "Working on it," he said. She looked at him briefly, then back at her work. "You can set whatever that is down on the chair if your arms are tired." He set the flour down on the indicated chair and stood in the middle of the shop feeling somewhat large and impractical, which was not a feeling he was accustomed to. The shop smelled of clean fabric and something faintly floral, lavender maybe, and there were bolts of cloth stacked along one wall in colors ranging from serviceable brown to a deep emerald green that caught the afternoon light and did something interesting with it. There were dresses in various stages of completion hanging from a rod near the back wall, and a dress form near the window wearing something white and partly assembled that made his chest tighten slightly before he redirected his attention. "What are you working on?" he asked for something to say. "Mrs. Hargrove's Sunday dress," Eva said. "She wants it done by the end of the week." "Is Mrs. Hargrove difficult?" he asked. Eva paused her treadle and looked at him with an expression of mild amusement. "Are you making conversation, Mr. Bristol?" "I am," he admitted. She studied him for a moment, then set her foot still on the treadle and gave him her full attention, which was slightly unnerving because she did not dilute it. "You came back," she observed. "I said I would," he said. "You also said you were sorting details," she said. "And yet here you are asking about Mrs. Hargrove." Isaiah put his hat in his hands, which was a gesture he made when he was being direct and he wanted whoever he was talking to understand it as such. "I'm not very good at this," he said. "At what?" Eva asked. "At this," he said, and the word encompassed something larger than he had the words to specify. Eva was quiet for a moment, regarding him with that clear, steady attention. Then she said, "Sit down, Mr. Bristol, before you wear a hole in my floor." There was no chair near him, so he perched on the edge of the wooden stool that lived near her cutting table, and Eva folded her hands in her lap and waited, which was somehow the most difficult thing she could have done. "I have been living in this town for 3 years," Isaiah said. "I know," she said. "So have I. We have spoken," he continued. "At the store, at church. That time the Jenkins barn burned and everyone came out to help." "I remember," she said. "I have been thinking," Isaiah said carefully, "for some time now that I would like to know you better than I do." Eva was very still. The afternoon light was coming through her shop window at a low angle and catching the dust motes and making them golden, and outside a horse went past at a slow walk with its hooves ringing on the dry ground. "Is the wedding dress for me?" she asked. Isaiah looked at her directly, the way he always looked at things he needed to see clearly. "Yes," he said. "I think it might be, though I understand that is a peculiar way to go about things." Eva studied him. "It is the most peculiar way I have ever heard of," she said, and her voice was calm and measured, though something behind her eyes had shifted into a territory that was harder to read. "You came in here and asked me to make my own wedding dress before you had said a single word to me about what you felt." "I know it," he said. "What would you have done?" she asked. If I had simply agreed and started taking measurements, would you have proposed then, in the middle of a fitting?" He thought about this with genuine seriousness. "Probably," he said. "That does not seem like the worst moment." Eva looked at him for a long moment, and then a slow smile began at one corner of her mouth and spread, and she said, "Isaiah Bristol, you are either the most confident man I have ever met or the most ridiculous one." "My ranch hand Pete believes it is the second," Isaiah said. "I'm hoping you will find it to be the first." She laughed again, softer this time, and the sound of it settled into the room like something that had always belonged there. "I barely know you," she said. "Not really." "That is what I would like to fix," he said. She was quiet. He watched her think, which was interesting to watch because she thought visibly, small shifts of expression moving across her face the way weather moved across an open field. Finally she said, "I will not make a dress for a woman who has not been proposed to." "That is reasonable," he said. "But I might agree to a walk," she said, "if you wanted to come back Sunday after church." "I would want to," he said. "Then Sunday," she said, and picked up her thread again with a composure that he strongly suspected was slightly more effortful than it appeared. He retrieved his flower from the chair, put his hat back on his head, and walked out of the shop into the afternoon sunshine feeling considerably better than he had in 3 weeks. The Sunday walk was the first of many. They went along the creek that ran south of town, where the cottonwood trees were coming into full leaf, and the water was still running high from the spring rains, and they talked about things that were easy first and then, gradually, things that were less so. He told her about growing up in Tennessee, the fifth of 7 children on a farm that had barely survived the war and hadn't survived the decade after it, and how he had come west at 22, with nothing except the stubbornness his mother had given him. She told him about Missouri and her mother, who had been a dressmaker herself and had taught Eva everything she knew, and about the particular loneliness of arriving somewhere new with a plan but no people, and how the plan had worked out better than she'd expected even as the people part took longer. "Do you like it here?" he asked her on the second walk, when they had found a fallen log by the creek that made a comfortable enough seat. "I do," she said. "I didn't think I would when I first came. Caldwell is rough, but there is something honest about it." "What do you mean?" he asked. She thought about it. "In Missouri there was a great deal of performance," she said. "People performing respectability, performing happiness. Here people are too busy surviving to perform much. What you see is mostly what is there." Isaiah considered this. "That can cut both ways," he said. "It can," she agreed. "But I prefer it. I always know where I stand." He looked at her. "Where do you stand with me?" he asked, and the question was genuine and direct and caught her slightly off guard. She turned it over carefully before answering. "I think," she said, "that I am figuring that out." "Fair enough," he said, and they sat with the creek running in front of them and the cottonwood leaves turning over in the breeze for a while before walking back toward town. May became June, and the walks became a regular fixture of their weeks, Sunday afternoons, and sometimes an evening during the week when his work allowed, sitting on the bench outside her shop after she had closed it for the day, or walking the length of the main street in the long golden light. The town noticed, because small towns noticed everything, and the noticing produced a range of reactions from the entirely supportive to the merely curious to, in the case of a few older women who had perhaps had their own eyes on Isaiah Bristol's prospects, the slightly chilly. Eva was aware of all of it with her usual clear-eyed calm. She had not spent 4 years building a business in Caldwell by being unaware of her social environment, and she managed the curiosity and the chilliness with the same brisk competence she applied to everything else. What she was less practiced at managing was the internal territory that Isaiah Bristol was slowly and methodically mapping, because she had been alone long enough that she had stopped expecting to feel the things she was beginning to feel, and the feeling of them was both wonderful and somewhat alarming. He was not what she had expected when she allowed herself to think about the kind of man she might want. She had thought she wanted someone more articulate, more demonstrative, someone who would fill the silence with reassurance because she had been so long without it. Isaiah was not a man who filled silences. He was comfortable in them in a way that initially unnerved her and then, gradually, began to feel like the opposite of loneliness. He listened with his whole attention, which was rarer than it should have been, and when he said something he meant it precisely, without decoration. In June, a small crisis arrived in the form of a cattle dispute. Two ranchers from the county, a man named Whitfield and another named Gorse, had been quarreling for months about a boundary line, and the quarrel had escalated to the point where Sheriff Dan Mercer was involved, and the town was divided into factions as small towns tended to be. Isaiah's ranch bordered Whitfield's land to the north, and he was called in as a witness because he had ridden that fence line enough to know it. He spent 3 days in town, attending meetings at the courthouse that were more tedious than dramatic, and on the evenings of those 3 days, he came to Eva's shop when she was closing up and they walked, and she listened while he described the proceedings with a dry patience that made her smile. "Whitfield is not wrong about the line," he said on the second evening, "but he is handling it wrongly. He keeps making it about principle instead of the fence, and when you make a boundary dispute about principle, you've got a war instead of a property argument." "What would you do differently?" she asked. "Survey it officially," he said. "Get the county assessor out there with a proper instrument and set the line on paper and then build a new fence. 2 weeks of work and it's done." "And you told them this?" "3 times," he said. "They are both enjoying being aggrieved more than they want the solution." Eva laughed. "That is very true of people in general," she said. He looked at her sidelong. "You are like that about anything." "Probably," she said, after honest consideration. "I have been known to hold a position past its usefulness because I do not like admitting it was wrong." "What kind of positions?" he asked, genuinely curious. She was quiet for a moment. "When I first came to Caldwell," she said, "I decided very quickly that I didn't need anyone, that the shop was enough and I was enough, and that was the shape of my life. And I have held that position for 4 years even when it was not entirely true." They had stopped walking without quite meaning to, standing on the edge of the main street, where the lamplight from the saloon across the way threw a wavering warm light across the dust. Isaiah was looking at her with that clear, steady attention that she had learned to recognize as the specific expression he wore when something mattered. "Is it still your position?" he asked. She looked back at him. "It is becoming less defensible," she said. He reached over and took her hand, which was the first time he had done so, and held it with a careful steadiness, and they stood there for a moment in the lamplight, while the sound of the saloon drifted across the street and somewhere down, toward the livery a horse blew out a long breath. Then they turned and walked back toward her shop in the warm June dark, and he said good night at her door and went to the hotel where he was staying for the 3 days, and Eva went inside and stood in her dark shop for a while, not lighting the lamp, just standing in the familiar smell of fabric and thread with her hand that he had held pressed against her own sternum. The cattle dispute resolved itself eventually, in roughly the way Isaiah had predicted it would, when both Whitfield and Gorse had exhausted their appetite for being principled and agreed to the survey. Isaiah rode back to his ranch and Eva's weeks resumed their shape, but the shape was different now in a way she couldn't have precisely articulated. The presence of someone in her week, even when he wasn't physically in town, had changed something in the texture of ordinary days. She found herself noting things she would tell him. She found herself looking up when the bell above her door rang with an attention that had not been there before. He came back to town the following Sunday, and their walk took them farther than usual, out past the edge of town to where the tall grass started, and the land opened up into the wide, particular silence of the Kansas plains. The sky was enormous, and the late afternoon clouds were building to the west in the dramatic purple and gold towers that preceded summer storms, and the air had that charged, electric quality that the plains wore before rain. "I want to show you something," he said, and they rode out to his ranch. she on the older mare he brought for her, he on his own horse, and he showed her the land and the house, and the way the light fell across the creek that ran through the eastern edge of his property. He was not showing her a house. She understood that clearly. He was showing her something he was proud of, and also something he was offering, not in a transactional way, but in the way that people show the things that matter most to them when they want another person to understand who they are. She stood on the porch of the house he had built himself, and looked out at the land and the building storm, and felt something shift irrevocably inside her. The last structural support of the position she had held for 4 years quietly giving way. "It is beautiful," she said, and she meant the land and the light and the solidity of the house and all of it. He stood beside her, and the first drops of rain began to fall, large and warm and widely spaced, the harbingers of something larger coming, and neither of them moved to go inside. "Eva," he said. She turned to look at him. The rain was beginning to come more steadily, and it was touching her hair and her shoulders, and she didn't care at all. "I am not good at speeches," he said. "You know that. I am going to say this plainly, and what I need you to know is that I mean every word of it, and I will not unsay any of it." He paused, gathering himself with the deliberate care that he applied to things that mattered. "I love you. I have been falling toward that for 3 years and arriving at it for the past 2 months, and I am done trying to be sensible about it. I want to marry you, if you will have me. I want this to be yours as much as it is mine. I want Sunday afternoons and the walks and the arguments I expect we will have, and all of it, for all the years there are." The rain was falling in earnest now, sheeting across the porch boards, warm and clean-smelling, and Eva Monroe stood in it and looked at the most direct and honest person she had ever met in her life, and felt the last of the lonely years falling away like something she had carried so long she had forgotten what it was like to set it down. "Yes," she said. He looked at her as though he needed to be certain he had heard correctly. "Yes," he said. "Yes," she said again, clearly and completely. He smiled, and it was the fullest smile she had seen on his face, which was not a face accustomed to smiling by halves. And then he stepped toward her, and she stepped toward him, and he took her face between his 2 large, calloused, work-honest hands and kissed her in the rain on the porch of the house he had built himself while the Kansas summer storm rolled over them both. She was laughing when they finally broke apart, rain-soaked and entirely happy, and he was laughing too, and he said, "Now we can talk about the dress." "I cannot believe," she said, still laughing, "that you walked into my shop and asked me to make my own wedding dress." "To be fair," he said, "I did not know it was yours when I walked in." "How long had you known it was mine by the time you left?" she asked. He thought about it honestly. "About 3 minutes into being in your shop," he admitted. She laughed harder. "3 minutes," she said, "and then you just kept going." "I committed to the plan," he said. "I did not know how to uncommit." She shook her head at him, water dripping from her hair, and said, "Isaiah Bristol, I am going to spend a very long time being exasperated by you." "I hope so," he said, and pulled her close, and the rain kept coming down in warm curtains around the porch, while the thunder moved over the horizon behind them. They went inside eventually, and she helped him light the stove, and they sat at the kitchen table he had built from pine boards, and she wrapped herself in a blanket he brought from the bedroom, and they drank coffee he made from the supply he kept in the kitchen, and they talked for 3 hours while the storm ran its course outside. They talked about everything that mattered and some things that didn't, and she learned that he kept a dog named Sutter who was old and arthritic and slept near the stove, and that he had read more books than she would have predicted, and that he had a sister in Tennessee named Mary who wrote him letters every few months that he kept in a tin box in the bedroom. He learned that she had once, in the first year in Caldwell, come close to leaving and going back to Missouri, and that she had stayed because of stubbornness and the sense that leaving would feel too much like defeat, and that she was glad now in a way that felt like it went all the way down to her bones. By the time the storm was over and the evening had settled into a cool-washed clarity, the matter of the wedding had begun to take on practical shape. They agreed on September, which gave Eva enough time to make the dress and gave Isaiah time to prepare the ranch house for her. They agreed on the church, which was the only church in Caldwell and was therefore not much of an agreement, and on the Reverend Alcott, who was a small, serious man who performed weddings with considerable dignity. They agreed that they would tell people together, which in the case of Caldwell meant that they would ride into town the next morning, and the information would propagate through every household by sundown without any further effort required, which was more or less what happened. The next morning Eva went to the general store while Isaiah was at the hardware, and she told Mrs. Tarkington, who ran the store with her husband, that she was engaged, and by the time she had walked back to her shop, the bell above the door had rung 7 times with visitors in various states of surprise and congratulation. Pete Dalloway came in sometime in the mid-morning with his hat in his hands and an expression of profound relief, and told Eva that he was very glad someone had sorted Isaiah out because the man had been impossible for months. "He rode into town and asked you to make your own wedding dress," Pete said, and his weathered face arranged itself into something that was trying to be respectful and not entirely succeeding. "That is a fact that happened." "It is," Eva agreed. "And you still said yes to him," Pete said. "Apparently I did," she said. Pete nodded slowly, as though this information was confirming something he had long suspected about the fundamental unpredictability of events. "Well," he said, "he built a good house. I'll say that." "He did," Eva agreed. She began the dress that same week. She had never made her own wedding dress before, which was an obvious statement but felt strange regardless, because there was something deeply peculiar about measuring yourself with the detachment of a seamstress when the subject of the measurement was your own hope. She chose white cotton lawn for the body of it, not silk, which was impractical, but the finest weight of cotton she could order through the general store's catalog, and she planned it simply and beautifully, with a fitted bodice and a full skirt and small buttons up the back that she would need help with, which was itself a kind of surrender she found she didn't mind making. She worked on it in the evenings after the shop was closed, and sometimes during the day in the quiet afternoon hours when customers were sparse, and the dress took shape slowly, and with the care she gave to everything she made that mattered. The town's women helped in various ways. Mrs. Alcott brought over a length of lace she had kept for years that she said her own mother had given her, and it was beautiful, cream white and delicate, and Eva used it at the cuffs and collar with a precision that made Mrs. Alcott cry a little when she saw it. Isaiah came to town every Wednesday and Sunday without fail. He was building things at the ranch to prepare for her arrival, adding a room off the kitchen that would serve as a workspace where she could take on smaller commissions and have her sewing machine, because he had thought about what mattered to her and understood that the work was not separate from who she was. She found out about the room by accident when Pete mentioned it in passing during one of his visits to town, and she rode out to the ranch on a Thursday afternoon and stood in the doorway of the not yet finished room and felt the particular sharp joy of being known. He was working in it when she arrived, fitting boards for the shelving, and he looked up when he heard her step and a slow, pleased expression crossed his face. "Pete told you," he said. "Pete told me," she confirmed. He stepped back and showed her the space, pointing out where the shelving would go and where he planned to put the window for the best light, and she stood in the middle of it and turned slowly and said, "Isaiah, you didn't have to do this." "I know," he said. "I wanted to." She crossed the room and took his face in her hands and kissed him, which was an action she was becoming more comfortable with, and he set down his hammer and wrapped his dusty, work-stained arms around her and held her there in the unfinished room that smelled of fresh wood and sawdust and possibility. In August, a complication arrived in the person of a man named Gerald Sprott, who rode into Caldwell on a roan horse with a letter of introduction and the manner of someone who expected things to go his way. He was from the land office in Wichita, and he had papers purporting to show that a section of land on Isaiah's eastern boundary, the section that included the good creekside grazing, was under a disputed claim from a settlement from 15 years ago that had never been properly cleared. He presented these papers to Isaiah with the smooth, rehearsed manner of a man who had delivered similar news before and knew what it generally produced. What it produced in Isaiah was a very controlled and very particular stillness that Pete Dalloway, who was present, recognized as significantly more dangerous than an obvious temper. Isaiah looked at the papers carefully. He looked at them twice. Then he handed them back to Sprott and said, "I will have my lawyer review these." Caldwell did not have a lawyer in residence, but a man named Alkindar Webb in Wichita handled ranch matters for several of the local operations, and Isaiah rode to Wichita the following day and was back within the week with Webb's assessment, which was that the claim Sprott had presented was real, but that the 15-year-old settlement it was based on had included a quitclaim deed that had never been registered at the county level, making the land's title effectively clouded but defensible. This was not a clean situation, and Isaiah knew it. A clouded title could tie up the eastern section of his land in litigation for months or even years, and the eastern section was not peripheral to the ranch's operation. He spent 2 days working through the problem with the systematic patience that characterized how he approached anything that required solution rather than force, and on the 3rd day, he had a plan. The plan involved riding back to Wichita with Webb, presenting the original deed records that he had filed when he bought the land in 1875, and arguing before the county land office that the quitclaim deed in question had been effectively abandoned when it failed to register. It was not guaranteed, but Webb thought it was their best position, and Isaiah was inclined to agree. He told Eva about it on Wednesday evening, sitting on the bench outside her shop in the warm August dusk. He told her all of it plainly and completely, which was the only way he knew how to tell things. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things he had come to understand about her, that she gathered the whole shape of a thing before she responded to it. "What happens if the claim holds?" she asked. "I lose the eastern section," he said. "The ranch is still viable without it, but it is smaller and the water situation becomes harder to manage." "And the wedding?" she asked. He looked at her. "The wedding is September the 14th, he said. "It does not change." She held his gaze for a moment, reading him the way she read everything completely and without rushing. Then she nodded once the way she did when she had finished deciding something. "Then go to Wichita," she said. "Win your argument, come back." "You are not worried?" he asked. "I am somewhat worried," she said honestly. "But you are the most thorough person I know. If it can be won, you will win it." The faith in her voice was not the blind kind, the kind that came from not knowing the risks. It was the kind that came from knowing a person's character completely enough to trust what they would do with hard circumstances, and receiving that kind of faith from Eva Monroe, who gave nothing without full consideration, settled something in Isaiah that had been tensed since Sprott had ridden into town. He went to Wichita. He and Webb spent 3 days presenting their case to the county land office, and on the 4th day, the office ruled that the unregistered quitclaim deed from 1863 was void, and the Bristol Ranch's title was clear. Sprott, it emerged, had been working on behalf of a land speculator out of Kansas City who had been buying up clouded title properties throughout the county and reselling them for profit after clearing them through legal pressure, and the county land office's ruling effectively ended his business in the Caldwell area. Isaiah rode back to Caldwell in the good, clean satisfaction of a problem fully resolved, and the first thing he did when he reached town was go to Eva's shop, and the bell above the door rang and she looked up from her work and saw his face and read it accurately in about 4 seconds. "You won," she said. "We won," he said. She set down her work and came around the counter, and he held his arms out and she walked into them without hesitation, which still felt like a small miracle every time, and he held her with his chin resting on top of her head, and she could feel the road, weariness in him, and also the solid, uncomplicated relief. "Good," she said quietly against his chest. Now go wash the road off you and come back for supper. I made stew." He laughed, which rumbled pleasantly through his chest. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She pushed him away with brisk affection and went back to her counter, and he went to the hotel for the bath and came back an hour later clean and considerably less road-worn. And they ate stew at the small table in the back of her shop, and talked about everything and nothing until the lamps were burning low. September arrived with the particular golden authority of Kansas autumn, the light going thick and honey-colored, and the nights cooling rapidly after the long heat of the summer. The town of Caldwell had been anticipating the wedding with the proprietary enthusiasm that small towns lavished on events that felt like communal celebrations. And Eva, who had always thought of herself as essentially private, found that she did not mind the communal enthusiasm as much as she might have predicted. Mrs. Alcott organized a gathering of the town's women at the church hall to help with preparations, and Eva brought the nearly finished dress and showed it, and the response was gratifying in the way that genuine appreciation always was. The dress was beautiful. She knew it with the clear judgment she applied to her own work, which was neither false modesty nor vanity. It was exactly what she had imagined, clean and simple and well-made, the cotton lawn falling the way good fabric fell, the cream lace at the cuffs and collar adding a softness that balanced the tailored line of the bodice. She had added a small detail she hadn't planned at the beginning, a tiny sprig of prairie flowers embroidered in white thread at the hem, so small it was nearly invisible but there if you looked. For herself, because no one else would see it and she wanted something that was entirely hers in the making of the thing. The 14th came on a clear, cool, brilliant morning with no wind, which in Kansas was itself a kind of wedding gift. Eva dressed in her room at the back of the shop. She had been living in those rooms for 4 years and would be leaving them after today, which produced a bittersweet feeling she acknowledged and allowed to pass. And Mrs. Alcott came to help with the buttons and the hair, and the Alcott daughters brought wildflowers that Eva held in a simple bunch, white and yellow and the pale prairie blue of chicory. She walked to the church on foot, which she had decided on deliberately because she was an independent woman who had walked herself everywhere for 4 years, and she was not going to be carried to her own wedding like cargo. The town watched her go, and people came to doors and windows and stepped out of the general store and the barber and the post office, and she walked through all of it with her head up and her flowers in her hands, and the white dress moving around her ankles in the slight morning breeze. Isaiah was already at the church. He was in the suit he had made in Wichita 2 weeks ago, a good dark wool suit that fit him properly and made him look like himself rather than like a man who had been put in a suit, which was an important distinction. Pete Dalloway stood beside him in a lesser but still respectable suit, and the Reverend Alcott stood at the front with his Bible, and the solemn, pleased expression he wore when officiating occasions he approved of. The church was full, because Caldwell had turned out comprehensively, and there was a warmth in the room that came from people genuinely wanting this particular thing to happen. Isaiah turned when he heard the door, and when he saw her, something happened on his face that Eva felt all the way across the church. He had a face that did not easily show every feeling, but this one it could not contain, and he looked at her with an expression of such complete and unhidden feeling that she had to take a breath before she could start walking. She walked down the aisle without being escorted, because there was no father to escort her, and she had no intention of performing the role of someone who needed to be led. She walked to him of her own choosing and stood beside him of her own choosing, and when the Reverend Alcott began, she listened to every word with the full attention she gave to everything that mattered. The ceremony was simple, and Reverend Alcott performed it with the dignified sincerity that was his particular gift. When it came time for vows, Isaiah spoke his directly and quietly, looking at her the whole time, and his voice did not waver. She spoke hers back with the same directness, meaning every word with the same thoroughness. She meant everything, And when Reverend Alcott said they could be declared man and wife, the church produced a collective sound that was mostly happiness with a small note of relief, which was the authentic sound of a community that had wanted something to happen finally seeing it happen. Isaiah kissed her in the church with a tenderness that was entirely him, careful and complete, and Pete Dalloway made a sound in the back of his throat that was possibly emotion, but which he would have strenuously denied was any such thing. The celebration that followed was in the church hall, organized by the women of the town, with the thoroughness that Caldwell women brought to important occasions. There was food that people had contributed from their own kitchens, and music from two fiddles and a man named Harris who played the harmonica with more enthusiasm than precision, but whose enthusiasm was infectious regardless. People danced in the cleared space at one end of the hall, including Eva and Isaiah, who had never danced together and discovered that they were well matched at it, which seemed on reflection to surprise neither of them. Pete Dalloway, who had drunk 2 cups of the punch and was therefore slightly more sentimental than his usual operating mode, cornered Eva near the food table and said, "I have known that man for 3 years and I have not once seen him look the way he looks today." "How does he look?" Eva asked. Pete thought about it carefully. "Like a man who has arrived somewhere he did not know he was going," he said. Eva looked across the hall to where Isaiah was talking to 2 of his ranch hands, and she saw exactly what Pete meant. There was a quality to him today that she had not seen before, something settled and fully inhabited, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly it." They rode out to the ranch that evening in the long autumn twilight, Eva's things already moved out there the previous day in the wagon Pete had driven over. The house came into view as they crested the low rise before the creek crossing, golden lit by the last of the sun, and Eva felt the rightness of it land solidly in her chest. The room he had built for her was finished and her sewing machine was already in it, placed by the window for the light the way he had told her he would place it, and the shelves were up and empty waiting for her bolts of fabric and her thread boxes and all the working equipment of her trade. She stood in the room in her wedding dress and looked at it, and he stood in the doorway watching her look at it, and she said without turning, "You are a very particular kind of man, Isaiah Bristol." "Is that good?" he asked. She turned around. "It is the best thing I know how to say," she said, and held out her hand to him. He came in and took it, and they stood together in the room he had built for her in the house he had built for them, while the last light of their wedding day went off the Kansas plain outside the window. The first year of their marriage was the fullest year Eva had ever lived. She kept her shop in town, riding in 3 days a week on the horse Isaiah had given her outright as a practical wedding gift, a good steady bay named Alice who had impeccable manners and an extremely high opinion of herself. The seamstress work continued and expanded, because a married woman who kept working was a slightly more legible figure to Caldwell than a single woman who worked, and the orders came more steadily, and sometimes from farther out on the plain, ranch wives who ordered by letter and received their finished goods by stage. She and Isaiah fell into the daily rhythms of the ranch with the interest of 2 people who were genuinely curious about each other's working lives. She learned the ranch's seasonal calendar, the way spring was calving and branding and fence repair, summer was managing the grass and the water, fall was the cattle drive south to the railhead, and winter was the maintenance and repair work that the rest of the year didn't allow. He learned the rhythms of the seamstress work, the way certain seasons produced certain orders, Christmas and Easter and weddings and funerals all driving different kinds of demand, and the way she could be in the middle of a delicate piece of work that looked like stillness but was actually highly concentrated effort. They argued sometimes, as she had told him they would. They argued about practical things mostly, the kind of arguments that came from 2 people with strong opinions and independent habits learning to share a household and a life. Eva had a method for the kitchen that she considered correct, and Isaiah had a different method that he considered equally correct, and the kitchen negotiations of the first month were conducted with the seriousness of a diplomatic congress. They resolved them the way they resolved everything, by talking until they understood each other's actual position rather than the surface of it, and then finding the place where both positions could coexist. He had a habit of leaving his boots in exactly the place she most needed to walk in the morning dark, and she had a habit of moving his things when she tidied without telling him where she had moved them, and these two habits collided with predictable regularity and produced exchanges that were part exasperation and part comedy. She told him where she moved things eventually, and he moved his boots, and they reached the equilibrium that people reached when they chose to choose each other daily rather than just at the altar. In the late spring of their first year, Eva discovered she was pregnant, which she determined from the particular combination of symptoms that she had observed enough in her customers to recognize. She told Isaiah on a Tuesday evening after supper, sitting at the kitchen table, and his response was a silence that lasted about 4 seconds, and then a slow, complete expression of happiness that was one of the finest things she had ever seen on a human face. He came around the table and crouched down beside her chair so he was at her level and took both her hands in his. "Are you well?" he asked first, because that was how his mind worked. "I am well," she said. "I am tired sometimes, but I am well." "What do you need?" he asked. "Absolutely nothing different from what I have," she said, and meant it, and squeezed his hands. Their son was born in November, delivered by the town's doctor and Mrs. Alcott, who had delivered half the babies in Caldwell and considered it part of her station. He was born on a cold, clear morning when the frost was still on the window glass, and the ranch was quiet, and he was healthy and full-voiced about his opinions from the first minute, which Eva felt was appropriate. Isaiah, who had been pacing the kitchen for 4 hours with Pete Dalloway sitting silently at the table in solidarity, came into the room when they called him and sat on the edge of the bed beside Eva and looked at the baby in her arms with an expression that she knew she would carry in her memory for the rest of her life. "He looks like you," Eva said. "He looks like a baby," Isaiah said, which was objectively true, but there was something in his eyes that was very far from objective, something enormous and helpless and completely unguarded. "What do we name him?" she asked. They had discussed names through the pregnancy, 2 lists, one for a boy and one for a girl, approached with the same thoroughness Isaiah brought to every decision. The name at the top of the boys' list was Daniel, for no reason more complicated than that they both liked it, and Daniel it was. Daniel Bristol proved himself from early infancy to be a person of definite opinions and considerable energy, which kept both his parents thoroughly occupied and produced in Isaiah a helpless devotion that Eva found extremely charming. Isaiah was not the kind of father who stood at a distance from the practical work of it. He was up in the night when the baby cried, and he carried Daniel on his rounds of the ranch once the weather permitted, and he talked to him seriously and at length on a wide variety of topics, apparently not considering it relevant that Daniel was 3 months old and not yet equipped to respond. "He listens," Isaiah said when Eva pointed this out. "He is a baby," Eva said. "He listens," Isaiah repeated, with the confidence of a man who had decided this was so and was not much interested in alternate interpretations. Daniel did, in fact, seem to listen. He was a calm and attentive baby when he was not expressing his opinions about hunger or cold, or the injustice of being put down when he wished to be held, and his dark eyes moved over faces with a focus that seemed, probably fancifully, to be genuine attention. Eva allowed herself the small private fancy that he was going to be like his father, a person who gathered all the information before saying anything about it. The second year of their marriage brought a drought that tested everyone in the region, the water coming short through the summer, and the grass going early, and Isaiah managing the herd's water access with the systematic precision that was his particular strength. The Bristol Ranch came through the drought in better condition than several of its neighbors, because Isaiah had built the creekside infrastructure carefully enough that, when the creek ran low, it ran reliably, and the water he had stored in the tank he had constructed in the second year of running, the ranch proved its value throughout that dry summer. He helped where he could. A rancher named Solomon Bray, whose place was north of the Bristol land and who had not had the resources or the foresight for the same kind of water preparation, came close to losing his herd, and Isaiah rode over in July and worked alongside Bray and his sons to divert water from the Bristol Creek onto the edge of Bray's grazing land, which was not required and was not asked for, and which Bray received with the particular emotion of a man who had been in genuine trouble and had been helped out of it. Eva watched this happen and added it to the complete and growing picture she had of the man she had married, and felt a deep, settled gratitude for the laugh she had given 3 years ago to a ridiculous request that had turned out to be the beginning of everything. The drought broke in September with 3 weeks of steady rain that filled the creek back to its summer level and turned the grass green again into October, and the sense of relief that moved through the region was almost physical. The fall cattle drive that year was good, prices strong at the railhead, and Isaiah came back from it in the 3rd week of October with the receipts and a length of emerald green silk that he had bought at the dry goods merchant in the rail town, because it was the exact color of the bolts in the back of her shop that had caught the light on the first day he had ever walked into it. "You remembered that," she said, holding the silk up to the light. "I noticed it," he said simply. She looked at the silk and then at him, and the years of the marriage were suddenly very present in the room, not as weight but as accumulation, all the mornings and evenings and arguments and resolutions, and Daniel growing in the corner of her seamstress room in a box padded with fabric scraps while she worked, and the way Isaiah said good night and the way he said her name. "I love you," she said, which she said often enough that it was not a ceremony but was never less than precise. "I love you," he said back with the same precision. She made herself a dress from the emerald silk that winter, for Sundays and occasions, and wore it the first time to church on Christmas morning when the whole town was there. Several people commented on it, and she accepted the comments with the satisfaction of a seamstress who knew when she had done her best work, but the dress was not for the comments. The dress was for the way Isaiah looked at her when she came out of the bedroom in it that Christmas morning, exactly the way he had looked at her on their wedding day, that particular expression of someone who had arrived somewhere he did not know he was going and found it entirely right. The years moved forward in the way of years when they are lived fully, not quickly exactly, but with a richness that made time feel inhabited rather than merely passing. Daniel was 3 when Eva discovered she was pregnant again, and this time she told Isaiah on the porch in the summer evening with Daniel already asleep inside, and his response was the same essential response as the first time, the silence, and then the happiness and the practical question about her well-being. Their second child was a daughter, born in the spring, and they named her Harriet after Isaiah's mother who had died the winter before, and whom he had been unable to get back to Tennessee to see before she passed, which was the hardest grief of his adult life, and which Eva had sat with him through on the long winter evenings when it was fresh. Harriet arrived in April, smaller than Daniel had been but equally vocal, and Daniel's response to his sister was initially one of great suspicion, and then, within 2 weeks, a proprietary protectiveness that made both his parents privately delighted. Pete Dalloway, who had become a fixture of the family in the way that certain people became fixtures, less employees than members of a household, turned up the day after Harriet was born with a carved wooden horse he had made over the winter, smooth and carefully done. He presented it to Daniel with the gruff deliberateness of a man who was very fond of children but was not going to make a performance of it, and Daniel received it with the seriousness of a person being given something properly significant. "For the new baby?" Daniel asked. "For you," Pete said. "So you've got something of your own while everybody's looking at the baby." Daniel looked at the horse and then at Pete with the straight-eyed directness that he had fully inherited from his father. "Thank you, Pete," he said, with the formal courtesy that both his parents had modeled. Pete Dalloway nodded and put his hat back on and went out to do something that needed doing, because he was not a man who lingered in sentimental moments that he himself had created. Eva, who had heard all of this from the next room, thought about it that evening and understood that what Pete had given Daniel was not just a toy, but a piece of evidence that being loved did not require being the center of attention. That love was a thing that extended and multiplied rather than divided. She stored this away with the other important things she had learned in the years of building her life in this place. Caldwell continued to grow and change around them, as towns along the Chisholm Trail did in the late 1870s and into the 1880s, adding a school and a second doctor and a proper bank that replaced the arrangement the general store had been providing. The railroad pushed further and the cattle trade shifted its patterns, and the town had its arguments about what it was becoming and what it should be. Eva, who had been there through the change, watched Caldwell with the affectionate attention of someone who was genuinely invested in a place, not as a neutral observer, but as a resident with a stake in the outcome. She had taken on an apprentice by this time, a young woman named Clara Vance, who had come to Caldwell with her family the previous year, and had a natural ability with fabric and needle that Eva recognized and valued. Clara was 19 and serious about her work and grateful for the teaching, and Eva found that teaching was something she was also serious about, that there was a satisfaction in passing on the skills her mother had given her that was its own kind of continuity. She paid Clara a fair wage, which was notable enough in Caldwell that people remarked on it, and she did not remark back but simply continued doing it. She also, through these years, became more involved in the life of the town in ways that went beyond her business. She was part of the group of women who organized the school fundraising, and she volunteered to sew the curtains for the schoolhouse when it was built, which she did with Clara's help over 3 weekends and delivered installed on a Monday morning before the first students arrived. She sat on the committee that reviewed the proposal for a town water system, not because she had particular technical knowledge, but because she had a clear head for weighing competing interests, and her contributions to that committee were noted and appreciated. Isaiah watched all of this with quiet pride that he sometimes expressed, and more often simply demonstrated by being steady in his own work, so that she had the time and freedom for hers, which was itself a kind of statement about what he believed. When Daniel was 6 and Harriet was 3, there was an incident at the ranch that produced the most frightened Eva had been since moving out there, which was a horse that came back without its rider, and the rider turned out to be Isaiah. He had come off at a fence line when the horse spooked at a rattlesnake, and had taken a fall that was more spectacular than damaging, bruised ribs and a sprained wrist, and a gash on his head that bled impressively without being serious. But Eva did not know any of that when she saw the riderless horse, and the 20 minutes between that sight and Pete riding up with Isaiah seated behind him were the longest 20 minutes of her life. She did not say any of the things she had thought during those 20 minutes once she confirmed he was not seriously hurt. She assessed the injuries with the calm competence she brought to everything that needed doing, and she cleaned the head wound and wrapped the wrist and made him sit still despite his resistance, which required the specific kind of firm insistence she had fully learned to deploy. Later, when he was settled and Daniel and Harriet were asleep and the ranch was quiet, she sat beside him in the bedroom and he looked at her in the lamplight and saw what she hadn't said. "I am sorry I scared you," he said. "People come off horses," she said. "It happens." "Eva," he said. She met his eyes. "I know it happens," she said. "I know it happens, and I know you are careful, and I know you have been doing this your whole life, and I was still terrified." "I know," he said. She reached over and put her hand over his wrapped wrist, carefully avoiding the bandaging. "Just be as careful as you can be," she said. "That is all I am asking." "Always," he said. "I have very strong reasons to be careful." She sat with him until the lamp burned low and he fell asleep, and she stayed for a while after that, listening to him breathe in the ranch house quiet, with the Kansas night outside the window and the two children asleep in the next room, and all of it exactly as it should be. All of it the life she had built from the beginning of a laugh in a seamstress shop. Daniel started school the fall of that year, which he approached with the same systematic seriousness he applied to everything he decided was worth applying it to. He was good at learning in the way that some children were simply suited to it, reading quickly and remembering what he read, and the school teacher, a patient young man from Ohio named Mr. Farris, told Eva at the first parents' meeting that Daniel was one of the most attentive students he had taught. Eva reported this to Isaiah, who received it with the expression of a man who was not surprised, but was gratified in a way he was going to be modest about. "He is a good thinker," Isaiah said. "He gets it from his father," Eva said. "He gets it from his mother," Isaiah said. "He gets it from both of us," Eva said, "which is probably why he is so thorough about it." Isaiah smiled at her across the kitchen table where they were having this conversation in the morning before the day began, the way so many of their conversations happened, in the ordinary frames of ordinary days, nothing ceremonial about it, just two people who knew each other completely talking across the start of a morning. Harriet, at 3 and then 4, was a different kind of person than her brother entirely, not because she was less intelligent, but because her intelligence ran in different channels. She was interested in everything physical, the horses and the chickens and the dogs and the weather, spending her time outdoors in all conditions with an enthusiasm that occasionally outran the supervision available. She was also, it emerged, interested in sewing, which Eva discovered when she found Harriet in her workroom one afternoon with a piece of scrap fabric and a needle, attempting to stitch it with the fierce concentration of someone who had decided to figure something out on their own. Eva sat down beside her and did not make a performance of the discovery. "Let me show you the right way to hold the needle," she said. Harriet looked at her with enormous serious eyes and said, "I almost got it." "You are very close," Eva said honestly. "Here, like this." She adjusted Harriet's small fingers on the needle with the patience she had always had for teaching, and Harriet's face went even more concentrated and then cleared with the satisfaction of something clicking into place. "I got it," Harriet said. "You got it," Eva agreed. Isaiah appeared in the doorway and looked at the two of them at the workroom table, his wife and his daughter with their dark heads bent together over a piece of fabric, and the expression on his face was the one Eva treasured most of all, the one that was simply and completely happy without any complication in it. By the time Daniel was 8 and Harriet was 5, the Bristol ranch had expanded again, not dramatically but steadily, the way Isaiah did everything, adding a section to the south that gave them access to a seasonal watercourse and improved the summer grazing. Pete Dalloway had taken on a junior role, training one of the younger hands named Thomas to take over more of the daily management, and Isaiah's operation had reached the size where it could be managed, rather than requiring his presence in every corner of it at every moment. This gave him a flexibility in his days that he used in various ways, including coming into town with Eva on her town days more often than before. He sat in the corner of her shop sometimes on those days, with a book or some small repair work, and was utterly unobtrusive in a way that Eva found both surprising and characteristically him. He was simply there, in the background of her working day, and customers who noticed him noticed only the settled, undemanding presence of a man who was comfortable being in a space that was not primarily his. He occasionally conversed with customers who addressed him, briefly and pleasantly, and then went back to his book, and Eva thought sometimes that this was one of the things she loved most about him, that he had no need to be the center of any room he was in. Clara Vance, who had been Eva's apprentice for 4 years and was now fully her assistant, treated Isaiah with the warm familiarity of someone who had observed a marriage, from a close enough angle to have genuine affection for both its members. She sometimes said things to him that she would not have said to the spouse of an employer in more formal arrangements, and Isaiah received these things with the equanimity of a man who was not easily bothered. On one particular afternoon, Clara said to him, without looking up from her work, "Did you know that Mrs. Monroe knew from the first week you started coming for walks that you were going to propose?" Isaiah looked up from his book. "She told you that?" he asked. "She told Mrs. Alcott," Clara said. "Mrs. Alcott told me." Isaiah considered this. "She knew before I proposed," he said. "She said you had the look of a man who had already decided something," Clara said, "and was just working up the order of the words." Isaiah was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then he said, "Was she correct?" "She is almost always correct," Clara said. "That is why she is my employer." Eva, who had been in the back room and could hear all of this very clearly, kept her face composed and continued threading the needle she was working with and said nothing. That evening on the ride home, Isaiah said to her, "You knew." "I suspected," she said. "You told Mrs. Alcott you knew," he said. "I told Mrs. Alcott I suspected," she corrected. "What was the difference?" he asked. She thought about it honestly, the way she always thought about things. "The difference was that I did not know if my judgment about you was reliable yet," she said. "I hoped it was. I suspected it was. I did not know it was. That took a little longer." He absorbed this in the way he absorbed things. They rode in the pleasant autumn evening light, the horses walking steadily on the familiar road toward the ranch. "When did you know it was reliable?" he asked. She thought about this one too. "Evening you told me about the land dispute," she said. "Not because of the dispute, because of the way you told me. You told me everything, including the part that was worse to tell. People who tell you the worst part are people you can trust to tell you the truth." He was quiet. Then he said, "That is very specifically observed." "I had 4 years of being alone to refine my observations," she said. "You were not alone after June of the first year," he said. "No," she agreed. "Not after June." They reached the ranch in the last of the evening light and put the horses up together. A task they had shared in this way for years now, easy and companionable. And then went into the house where Daniel was at the kitchen table with a book, and Harriet was on the floor building something architectural out of blocks that Pete had carved for her. And the smell of the supper Eva had prepared before leaving that morning was warm in the air. Isaiah put his hat on its hook and looked at the room, and the people in it, with the expression that needed no analysis. He sat down beside Harriet and asked her what she was building, and she explained with great seriousness that it was a barn, and he looked at it seriously, and said she had the load-bearing structure right, but the roof would need another support beam. And Harriet considered this, and added another block, and the structure improved. Eva set supper on the table, and called them all to it, and they came. Isaiah lifting Harriet to her chair, and Daniel closing his book with the deliberately reluctant gesture of a child who did not want anyone to know how engaged he was. And they sat down together in the lamplight of the ranch house kitchen, and the evening settled around them. After supper, after the children were in bed, Eva and Isaiah sat on the porch in the way they often sat after the day was done, in the particular comfortable quiet of two people who did not require the silence to be filled. The sky over the Kansas plain was enormous and scattered with stars, the kind of sky that was only visible from places where the dark was genuinely dark, and the night was cool and smelled of dry grass and the first trace of the coming autumn. "Are you happy?" Isaiah asked, which he asked her sometimes, not because he was uncertain but because he liked to hear her answer. She considered it the way she considered everything, as a real question deserving a real answer. "I am," she said, thoroughly and specifically and without reservation. "Good," he said. "Are you?" she asked. "Yes," he said, without hesitation or qualification. "Every day." She reached over and took his hand in the dark, and they sat there together on the porch while the stars moved in their slow, enormous arcs overhead, and the ranch was quiet around them, everything settled and right, the whole good weight of the life they had built together resting as lightly as the night air. They sat there until the chill came up enough to make the indoors appealing, And then they went inside and banked the stove and checked the children and put out the lamp, and settled into the ease of two people who had learned the language of each other's presence so completely that being together was the most natural state of things. The years continued to pass in their rich, inhabited way. Daniel grew into a boy who was tall for his age and serious about his interests, which were horses and books and the particular science of how things worked. And Isaiah began teaching him the ranch work when he was 9 with the same systematic patience he applied to everything. Harriet grew into a girl who was everywhere at once and interested in everything, who followed Eva around the workroom when she could, and followed Isaiah around the ranch when she could, and was generally the person most likely to be in the exact place no one expected her to be, for reasons that always made complete sense once she explained them. They had a third child the year Daniel turned 10, another son, born in March and named William for no man in particular, but because it was a name that suited him from the first day, something solid and uncomplicated that he could grow into. William was from the beginning the most contented of the 3 children, happy to observe before acting, watching his older brother and sister with a calm, interested attention that reminded Eva powerfully of Isaiah. 3 children, Isaiah said, on the night William was born, sitting beside Eva in the way he always sat after their children arrived, close and attentive and not anywhere else. 3 children, she confirmed. Is this what you wanted, he asked, when you came to Caldwell with your sewing machine? Did you want this? She thought about the woman who had stepped off the stage in Caldwell in 1874 with a modest inheritance and a plan and no particular picture of the future beyond the immediate shape of the shop. I wanted something, she said. I did not know what. I had not imagined this specifically. Are you glad it turned out to be this? He asked. She looked at him in the lamplight of the bedroom where they had lived together for years, with the sound of Daniel and Harriet asleep in the next room and William in his small bassinet beside the bed. Isaiah, she said, I am so glad that sometimes it is almost frightening. He took her hand. Do not be frightened of it, he said. I am not, she said. Not really. I just am sometimes aware of how specifically good it is and I want to hold it carefully. We will hold it carefully, he said, together. She looked at him in the quiet of the room and thought about the morning she had laughed at him across the counter of her shop, with his hat in his hands and his perfectly confident certainty about something he had not yet sorted the details on. And the laugh that had come out of her had been the realest thing she had produced in years. The first moment in Caldwell, where she had been completely and genuinely herself without calculation. And the thing that had come after it had been this, all of it. Building and continuing and growing in the Kansas years. You know, she said, when you walked into my shop and asked me to make a wedding dress before you had proposed to anyone, I did not think I was looking at the man I would spend my life with. What did you think? He asked. I thought you were the most peculiar customer I had ever had, she said. And then I thought you were probably not as ridiculous as the request made you seem. And then you left and came back and I revised my estimate upward several more times. He smiled. You are telling me I grew on you, he said. Like something extremely stubborn and extremely good, she said. He laughed and the laugh was warm and real in the quiet room, and William stirred briefly in his bassinet and then settled again, and outside the Kansas night was clear and cold and full of stars. Go to sleep, Isaiah said. You need the rest. In a moment, she said, and she stayed awake a little longer while he drifted, watching the dark of the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the house and the night, all of them familiar and beloved, the particular music of a life that had been built note by note from a single laughing moment in a seamstress shop. In the autumn of the following year, Clara Vance came to Eva with news that she was being courted by Thomas, the young ranch hand that Pete Dalloway had been training up to take on more of the Bristol ranch management, and that things seemed to be going in a serious direction. Eva received this news with the genuine warmth she felt and offered Clara a morning off to have Sunday lunch with Thomas's family, and then sat down and had the conversation with Clara that Clara needed to have, about what it meant to continue working after marriage, and about how the right person would not ask her to stop. "Mr. Bristol never asked you to stop," Clara said. "Mr. Bristol built me a workroom," Eva said. "The right person shows you who he is by what he does, not only what he says." Clara looked at her with the clear-eyed attention of someone taking an important note. "And Thomas?" she asked. "I think Thomas is good," Eva said honestly. "I have watched him for 3 years. He is steady and kind, and he respects the work he does and the people he does it with. Those are not small things." Clara nodded, satisfied. Thomas and Clara were married the following spring, in the same church in Caldwell where Eva and Isaiah had married 8 years before, and Eva made Clara's dress, which was a beautiful ivory muslin with delicate pin-tucking at the bodice that took her 3 weeks, and was the finest piece of work she had done since her own wedding dress. Clara cried when she put it on for the fitting, which Eva permitted for approximately 30 seconds before handing her a handkerchief and telling her to breathe carefully, or she would have to let the bodice seams out. Isaiah and Eva sat together in the church pew watching Clara and Thomas take their vows, and Isaiah leaned slightly toward Eva and said very quietly, "Do you remember ours?" "Every word," she said. He took her hand the way he had taken it in the lamplight on their wedding night, with careful steadiness, and held it through the rest of the ceremony. Pete Dalloway, seated on the other side of Isaiah, noticed this and looked forward at the altar with the expression of a man who was absolutely not moved and would not be entertaining alternate interpretations. The Bristol ranch continued to grow, and the Bristol family continued to fill the house that Isaiah had built with their particular version of life, which was busy and direct and warm, and occasionally loud, when the children were all in the same room with opinions about the same subject. Daniel was a teenager now, and working the ranch in the summers with a competence that made Isaiah's chest full with the particular pride that was specifically about watching someone you loved become their own person. Harriet was learning to sew with serious intent and also learning to ride with the same intent, and it was becoming clear that she was going to be someone who did exactly what she decided to do and did it completely. William was the calm center of the 3 of them, watchful and sweet-natured, already the kind of child that adults trusted with things without quite knowing why. Eva's shop flourished. She had expanded the space, renting the room next to the original shop when the barber moved to larger premises, and Clara ran the front while Eva managed the more complex work and the business arrangements. It was a small enterprise in the way that small meant real and sturdy rather than insignificant, and Eva was proud of it with the solid pride of something built from her own work over many years. On a particular evening in October, when the children were in bed and the ranch was in its autumn quiet and Isaiah and Eva were on the porch in their habitual way, Eva said, "I have been thinking about something." "Tell me," he said. "I would like to take on a second apprentice," she said. "There is a girl who came in last week, daughter of the Monroe family out on the Eastern Road. She is 17 and she wants to learn the trade, and she has good hands and good attention. But she cannot pay for instruction." Isaiah thought about this. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I am thinking I teach her as my mother taught me," Eva said, "without payment for the instruction, in exchange for the work she contributes to the shop." "Then do it," he said. "It will not bring in more money immediately," she said, because she always gave him the full picture. "We are not in need of more money immediately," he said. "Do it because it is right to do." Eva looked at him in the autumn dark. "You are an extremely good man," she said. "You say that," he said, "and then you still argue with me about where I leave my boots." "Both things are true simultaneously," she said. He smiled, and it was the fullest smile she had ever seen on any face, the one that belonged specifically to him, full and uncomplicated and completely present. And she thought that she would never in her life stop being grateful for the ridiculous, peculiar, wonderful morning he had walked into her shop with his hat in his hands and asked her to make a wedding dress she had not yet been asked to wear. That was the whole shape of it, she thought. All these years later, with the stars overhead and the Kansas night around them and the children asleep in the house behind her, and the man beside her, who was exactly who he had always been, steadfast and honest and entirely hers. That was the whole shape of a life. A laugh in a seamstress shop, a walk by the creek, a proposal in the rain, a dress stitched with a hidden sprig of prairie flowers at the hem, and then all the years of choosing and being chosen, building and holding carefully, day after day, in the good, ordinary, extraordinary miracle of it. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the comfortable quiet until the night was well along, and the cold made the indoors call them back. And they went in together to the house that was theirs, to the life that was theirs, and closed the door on the dark, and everything was exactly as it should be.